Emerald Podcast Series. Research that makes a difference.
Hello, welcome to the Emerald Podcast Series. My name is Thomas, and my guest today is Dr. Ellen Kossek, a leading US social scientist and thought leader on work, family, and employment issues. She studies how people, managers, and organizations can improve workplace cultures and the effectiveness of work-family policies to foster well-being at work and home. She is the Basil S. Turner Distinguished Professor at Purdue University's Mitchell E. Daniels Jr. School of Business and the co-author of Work-Life Flexibility Policies, Moving from Traditional Views Towards Work-Life Intersectionality Considerations, along with Brenda A. Lauch, Matthew P. Perugino, Jeffrey H. Greenhouse, and Tarini J. Merriweather. The article is available open access from Emerald. Okay, thank you very, very much for joining me. You wrote a very, very interesting article on work-life flexibility. So to start with a more difficult question, what is work-life? And maybe what is work-life flexibility?
Work-life is the relationship between your work roles and your personal life or non-work roles. And yes, work is part of life, but as we saw during the pandemic, increasingly, they may feel like one if you're teleworking at home, and teleworking is one form of flexibility. And I think one of the hard things now with the digitalization of work, and I recently gave a talk at the a digitization of work and life center at University of Sussex, that people are really trying to manage boundaries between work and home. So flexibility, originally work-life flexibility was thought of as things like flex time, telework, part-time work, working 4 10-hour days instead of 5 days a week. And they were thought of as alternative work arrangement policies. They started with, in some cases, where women wanted to work a reduced load or have flex time to care for children. But it's been used by workers in all different occupations. We see in hospitals such as NHS in the UK, doctors wanting to work 3 12-hour shifts. And so it's really grown as a alternative way of working, and really the new normal is working alternatively. Everybody's working a customized work shift. And one of the things we did with the article that we did for Emerald, which is on moving from traditional approaches on work-life flexibility to intersectional approaches, is we also link the idea of permeability, or when you're connected to work or non-work, as another form of work-life flexibility. In the traditional literature, they kind of the people who study virtual work and remote work are in one camp, and they're looking at how you're using email, text, which devices you're using. Are you distributed globally across borders? How connected are you constantly to a device for communications? And they kept that separate from these other flexibility forms. But really, we're increasingly using multiple forms of flexibility at one time, and our smartphones and the ability to work anywhere, anytime. Even if you are a frontline worker who works face-to-face, you likely have a smartphone on you or near you, or your employer makes you manage it to lock it up when you come in to work, as I learned studying retail workers. So I really look at these as all forms of flexibility, and how you really, to simply put, work-life flexibility is how you're using, in this case, policies from your employer to, or the government. Right in the UK, you have the right to request a flexible schedule. How you're using flexibility to manage the boundaries of your work role.
And you mentioned the boundaries there. The article goes into a number of different types of boundaries. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So boundaries, it used to be pretty clear when you were at work or at home, because you would travel and go work at an office where everybody worked on site, or all work at a manufacturing plant or a hospital. But now there are increasingly parts of our jobs or whole jobs that are done remotely, or there's negotiation over even work schedules and the hours of work. So I know in the UK there are quite a lot of strikes, because one way that they're managing in some cases transportation is they're understaffing, not having extra people, so people have forced overtime. Would be an example of a boundary of your schedule that's expanded? So in another article published in the Journal of Management with some of the co-authors on this article, Matthew Perugino at City University of New York and Brenda Lauch, a dean at Simon Fraser University in Canada, we thought about a way to think about boundaries holistically, because a lot of the literature is fragmented. So flex time could be thought of as boundaries over the timing of your work, setting limits about when I'm available for work or not. And the idea of part-time work would be boundaries over the size or the amount of your work role. You want to reduce your hours, for example. Telework, remote work, or boundaries over location of your work. Are you able to do it in multiple places? And then I mentioned the idea of permeability. What is the boundaries of when you're expected to be connected to work? There are lots of jobs like social workers, doctors, people on call for IT. And even when they're at home, they may have trouble setting work off or returning work off. And the boundaries could go another way too. Can your family contact you at work to let you know that there was a problem at school today and they're coming home early? So this is a contested terrain increasingly between employees and employers on how to manage the boundaries of our work in relation to other parts of our lives.
It's really, really interesting. And it's an area that I understand has been changing quite rapidly over the last few years.
Yes, and I think the pandemic brought it to a head, made it very transparent that there was an inequality in people's access to work-life flexibility. So our grocery workers, our police, our healthcare workers could not stay at home during the pandemic. They had to go on site, putting themselves at risk and their families for perhaps getting sick or even dying. And then we had people at home that, if they were professionals or admins and able to do some or all of their job at home. But as you know, in London, in big cities, there's small apartments. So some people, were bringing our entire offices to home. That was stressful for family and friends. And then when you have domestic labor, where children were home from school, and people were then expected to take care of their kids, an infant, or manage school while doing their full-time jobs. That did have some gender disparities, where I did a study of women in STEM in the US, nearly 1,000, and it kind of pushed a lot of STEM women to, they wanted to work, right? The narrative was women dropped out. Many people, and dads too, and people with elder care, wanted to work, but they ended up doing two jobs at once, work intensification, and it generally burnt people out. We're still seeing some remnants of children being behind in school, and people now questioning their relationship to work and how central work should be in their lives. And I do think it's a little better in the UK than the US, and that you do have now growing number of policies like the right to request a flexible schedule, where even though there might be a stigma to using it if you're in a high-powered job, you at least have a permission to ask. And I think that is another trend, where you have government trying to set up norms where workers, or legislation where workers can ask for flexibility regardless of the reason. Let's not get into whether it's for you to go to the exercise because it makes your mental health better, which is a growing trend that we're dealing with, that people are facing more and more mental health challenges, or caring for people, for childcare, for elder care, for your pet, to shorten your commute so you only have to pay to go into work 3 times a week. Let's focus more on the work to be done, and not care about where it is. Work is something you do, not a place you go. And let's also try and help people to work longer, or be able to have variability in their career to stay in the labor force, because our industrialized countries are going to have huge bankruptcy problems as social service programs become bankrupt because not as enough young people are working to pay for public sector pensions and things like that. I'm not interested in the flexibility where people have lack of job security, gig workers, they don't get benefits. We're focusing in this talk about work-life flexibility that helps people manage the relationship between work and non-work roles.
So we're looking for some stability in people's lives.
Stability, and not be so one-sided that the employer says, here's the deal, you only do it, nor the employees can say, oh, I'll only do this. I mean, you got to work on a team. You can't make it so hard for your boss to find you your customers. And so I do think it has added a layer of complexity where some people are not able to regulate their attention and be focused when they're at work or if they're working at home. And the same for employers. I've done some research where I've come up with a respecting time off scale, because I think people are constantly negotiating, can I do I have to take this call on my vacation, or it's Friday night at 6 p.m. I'm really looking forward to taking a break over the weekend. Yet we all know that we've seen people answer emails and texts that are work colleagues at night over the weekend. And once again, if you are a single parent, or you have friends and want to connect with them, social connections are very important. You would like to have the flexibility to at least take a call, a text at work, or a call from your doctor. And there's certain jobs where we're privileged, where people can do that. I can get an email anytime or text, but other jobs, people don't set their own schedule. So I think work-life scheduling, staffing, this is how much people's work hours, whether you could work remotely from an island in the Pacific, if you met the hours in London, everything is up for negotiation. And I see some employers, I just came from a conference out in East Coast at Rutgers on women and hybrid work. Some employers are embracing flexibility in all these forms. And some of them are pulling back and say, oh, if we could only go back to the way it was before the pandemic, and saying, if you want your job, you have to come in all the time. Or we have inflexible flexibility, where you can, have flexibility, but only one day a week. Well, maybe that's not the day that your, parent-teacher conference is at school. How does that help you for your child?
And you mentioned also the inequalities. There's gender inequality. There's also age, education, industry. There's a range of inequalities that exist today in flexible working.
Yes. And in the article I did for Emerald, the chapter that we just published, we think that there's this need to move toward intersectional approaches. And what do we mean by that? Well, intersectionality, has been used traditionally with gender and race. And here we think intersectionality also might be the chance that you might be stigmatized for using flexibility, or based on your family status, gender, race, and also you might have less access because to work-life flexibility. A lot of the reports show that people of color and women tend to be clustered in the lower levels of the organization and lower paid jobs. Those jobs tend to have less access to flexibility. And as you become a professional and move on up, even if you're the supervisor of that airplane plant, you might be able to have more of a say of your hours, or have someone to back you up. The hospital attendant that's caring for you and that, has to be there all the time and may have less of a say over their schedule. And sometimes attendance policies are set up that if you miss work too much, you get fired. So we need to have a way for people to really have flexibility. We need to be flexible on flexibility.
What are some creative approaches that companies have been able to use?
Well, for the manufacturing, as I mentioned, one is through staffing levels, to have an extra staffing person that can cover multiple jobs, because that builds in flexibility into your system. Another would be the idea of allowing workers to help manage their own schedule through sanctioned shift trades. Now, I've studied nursing homes, And there you have a patient acuity needs where you have to have people with certain types of training for the sickness of the client, the patient. So I can't just trade with you if I'm like trained in only one aspect of care, maybe basic care, but not something for somebody with more severe illness. So we also need to have literacy to train the workers on how to self-manage flexibility and trade-off shifts. But I do think that will ultimately increase skill levels and flexibility of the organization. So that would be something to do with for frontline jobs. You can also give people more paid sick leave and as have replacement workers. It does get expensive, but for example, we hire a lot of nurses and doctors now. They're going to be shortages, but we hire people and pay a per diem because hiring levels are sometimes linked to the patient occupancy rates in hospitals and things. Now, for people like who are professionals that could work on a laptop anywhere, they are sort of the digital privileged class. But the thing that is challenging there is some people don't know how to telework well at home. So one thing I learned early on was IBM once did a study that if you had a separate space for where you did your work, that was a really good way to set boundaries even within your home. Have a set routine for your physical, mental, and psychological boundaries. The other thing is we need to have some way that we don't burn people out and make them feel they have to choose between their having a family, getting married, having a relationship in their personal life. The real challenge for many organizations is they saw work-life flexibility as just a benefit for working mothers or when people need an individual, what's called an ideal, an idiosyncratic deal with their boss. And we really need to mainstream this and say, here are the rules for how you can manage it with some parameters. Northern Trust, which is in London, I studied their groups in Chicago, and they were paying so much money for expensive downtown office space. And that's one thing that companies are trying to support. They sign these long-term contracts for real estate. But at Northern Trust, they migrated whole teams. They looked at the job and said, can this job be done off-site? And if it was, the team would migrate together. So then you're not the only one working differently. And they set it up so that if you'd have to come into the office at your choice, a day a week minimum, and then you could work at home. You had to have backup electricity if something went out. Your computer was a soft telephone, so people knew how to call you, because I know I feel crazy calling people at home. So you got to come up with new norms for work groups and teams, and don't put it just all on the manager to manage. Can I have Tuesday off? Teams now have to be managing these flexibility, and that takes more work.
Absolutely. But I'm very interested. So you're saying it sounds like initially the idea of flexible working was being pioneered by women in the workplace.
I think so. I mean, there are probably other industries you can look at, like the Tavistock coal miners, I believe was in the UK. They experimented with socio-technical systems, and I think they went through teams, some alternative work hours or, shorter work weeks. But it really started out as this idea of an accommodation, and you were more likely to give it to your best employees, right? What's hard is giving flexibility, more mainstreaming it to everyone. And then, in this Harvard Business Review article I published called The Future of Flexibility, I think it was published in 2022, and I mentioned it was picked as a best top 10 article for HBR must read for 2023 in a reprint book. We started out with this sort of accommodation. Mother, may I use flexibility? Yeah, and you'd say, I don't want Sally to leave the workforce after her first baby. We'll make a deal. Let's make a deal. And that's okay, but it's a special deal. And people are like, well, Sally's not really going to be executive level. And Mary, who is not quite as good a worker than Sally, but is solid, we're not going to give it to her. So it was really not very equal. And then we saw during the mobile workforce stage where like the IBMs, the Accentures, the Deloittes, the Price Waterhouse Coopers, they went to a remote sales and professional workforce as a way to save on office space and have employees travel all over and work with the customer out of their homes. And that was actually more male, a lot of that. And they really learned how to do it. And I can say professors have had hybrid work for quite a while. They teach and do their jobs so people would work at home. But then we saw during the pandemic, or even before the pandemic, some people would maybe work long hours because of their identity. Their professional identities are linked so much to their jobs as a way to keep flexibility, right? I want my boss to think I'm motivated. So that led to overwork cultures, long hour cultures. And then we saw during the pandemic, people were forced flexibility, which I don't call work-life flexibility, working out of their home. People were somewhat depressed because they were online all the time, trying to do two jobs. I gave some talks to some corporations, and there was a story of one woman saying the first day they were sent home after the pandemic, her autistic child was having a meltdown, and her boss kept texting her and calling her, and she's like, look, I can't do it now. And so we had to disclose things to our bosses about ourselves. There's electronic monitoring going on sometimes into our homes. There are privacy issues. Maybe you don't want to see that I have a poster of a political person on my back wall, or what religion I am, or what the ethnicity of my husband or children are. So I do think we're kind of in a new frontier of new rules. I do think it could also, though, if implemented in a way that doesn't stigmatize people, which was one of the ideas that we had in this article about flexibility, that there is more risk for certain groups to use flexibility, it could lead to many people with disabilities, mental health concerns, could provide a lifeline for people to work longer and be in the workforce if they can work from home or have the reduced hours and self-manage it. And I'm worried post-pandemic that some employers will say, this is too much work to manage. Let's go back to everybody works the same hours the same way.
It's interesting. One of the traditional problems with, say, work from home was that work not seen is not always valued, right? So there's the element of trust.
Exactly, Thomas. And that is one challenge. Companies have not invested into training managers and employees how to manage performance. It depends on the nature of the work. And that's really wonderful question. Not all companies have thought about is how to embed flexibility, work-life flexibility into how they manage performance, how they select people, how teams work, client expectations, how we reap the benefits of flexibility. It's saving companies an awful lot of money when people are working out of their homes. We wouldn't let people bring all their kids to work. That would be save money on childcare. It's not really fair.
I have worked for a company where they questioned, could we just have a crash? Well, why not? Why not?
Using that with flexibility is a way to attract and keep a younger workforce. It doesn't even have to be brick and mortars. I would like to see companies band together and train more licensed family daycare providers and help subsidize the pay for our child and healthcare workers. Flexibility is not just to care for people, but there are an awful lot of caregivers that need it, and also self-care. And we need to put more into having a bigger supply of caregivers, or you've got to give people more flexibility. So if you put those two strategies together, the governments and the companies that get it together to support this, they're going to have the edge. I mean, women are half of our university students, but they are not rising to the top of most of our organizations. They're very underrepresented in mid and senior levels, particularly in many STEM fields. This is really a problem. The one type of flexibility companies do the worst job at is dealing with good part-time and reduced load work, because they don't like to define what is a full-time load, because exempt workers work as long as it takes. And this might even be from the British, work ethic Protestant, where, staff work is never done. You can always do more. And we really do need to do a better job. And this is why unionization is rising in some places, of saying what is good quality full-time work and then what is going above and beyond.
It is interesting what our 9 to 5, Monday to Friday work week was set during the Industrial Revolution, now with the information revolution, where trying to come up with some kind of replacement.
Exactly. And these models, adapting it to these different types of industries where you're working with people across different time zones. In our HBR article, one of my colleagues who was originally from India looked at how industrialized societies get the prime hours for when people in call centers or in other industries would be available. So somebody's up in the middle of the night in India to answer a call center for a rental car in the US. So you could also think about flexibility globally and how powerful nations set the work hours of other nations that might get into their work-life flexibility demands.
I am curious, on one point, you did mention the importance of identity when people are choosing to work extra long hours and so on. For some people, work is very much part of their identity. Like you ask them, what are you? And a lot of people just answer with their job.
Exactly. And I've came up with an assessment, a leadership assessment called Flex Styles. And it manages how you manage interruptions between work and non-work. It clusters that to your identity. And your identity, many people see themselves as more work-centric. Others see themselves as more family or non-work-centric. And that used to be the assumption that if you were highly work-centric, you couldn't possibly be highly non-work-centric. Many people today are dual-centric, high in wanting to do well in their work role and their non-work role, and they see that they can't do both well. And so we're seeing people delay having children, delay getting partnered, because companies don't make it easy to be dual-centric anymore. You're all in all the time. And then the third aspect of this flex style, so you have how you manage interruptions between domains, what's your cluster of your identity, and then how in control you are of your boundaries. And that can be due to your job design, that you don't have a lot of control because your employer has all the power. It could also be due to your family design. Maybe you are a single mother, maybe you have a partner that is not involved very much in caregiving. So when problems happen, you're the one that's always deals with if the babysitter doesn't show up. Maybe you're less wealthy, so you're doing an hour and a half commute in London or wherever to get to your job. These are all linked in some ways to your identity, your wealth, and your occupational status.
It's very, very interesting. And as we come slowly towards the end of this interview, could I ask, how do you see this going forward? You've seen some tremendous changes in the last few years. Do you see that carrying on into the next few years?
Certainly, I think that there will be wide variation in how employers respond to employees' growing interest and need for work-life flexibility, and how, when, and where they work, and how connectivity is managed over their life course. And I think there will be, 20 to 30% might be high of employers that will embrace work-life flexibility whole hog, or at least give a lot of more latitude to workers. There'll be a middle hybrid work group that will say, we'll give you some flexibility, but you got to be in 3 or 4 days a week. You can't live 3 hours away from us. But there might be other employers that say, as long as you're willing to come in on your own nickel or what pound or whatever your currency is a few times a year, you can live forever. So there will be this fully remote group or fairly embrace remote group. There'll be a middle hybrid group. And then we're going to go back to the traditionalists that say, we set the hours, take it or leave it, not very flexible at all. But given we're not giving lifelong job security to people anymore, work-life flexibility is something that could make the difference to keep people in your company and in your occupation. And those employees that look at it as part of talent management and how to leverage it for improving their work processes, I think will have higher productivity and will have competitive edge financially and increase longevity. So I didn't even mention about the 410 experiment that's going on in England down by Brighton, where they're trying to see what happens there with 410 work weeks.
4 days a week, 10 hours.
Exactly. But I've been doing a lot of experiments, randomized control trials, where in some cases you have the new way of working done in one organization and you randomize, and another organization does usual practice, doesn't get it. and you compare, just like when you compared the COVID vaccine, who got it, who didn't, to see what the productivity and social effects are. I think that's where we have to go, is improve the science of these. It's really a social science experiment, but the jury is still out on how to implement flexibility, not just at the individual issue and org level, but this multi-level interaction. And that's really where research needs to go as well as practice.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more information about our guest and for a transcript of today's episode, please see our show notes on our website. I would like to thank Daniel Ridge for his help with today's episode and Alex Jungius from This Is Distorted. You've been listening to the Emerald Podcast Series.